just give a very brief introduction to Carol Dweck, who, as I was going to say, everywhere I've ever been, I think, when I was at BBN, I remember running a reading group, and we read one of her papers from Psych Bulletin from the early 90s, and then when I was at Park as an intern, I wanted people to know about her research. I used it in my own dissertation, and tonight I'm just totally delighted that she's going to be talking. So rather than say any more, I'll just let Carol come up.
Thanks, Paul. Am I mic'd?
You are.
Okay. I want to start with a quote from Benjamin Barber, an eminent political scientist. He said, "I don't divide the world into the weak and the strong, or the successes and the failures. I divide the world into the learners and the non-learners." Why would anyone become a non-learner? We're born with such an exuberant, irrepressible desire to learn. You never see an unmotivated baby. It looks crazy, right? Instead, you see babies being infinitely curious and approaching the most daunting tasks of a lifetime with gusto. But many of the things we do to help and motivate students and other people make them into non-learners. When we put too much emphasis on being gifted or talented, when we put emphasis on test scores, getting into the one right school, or otherwise being a genius, we create people who feel they have to be infallible. And employers are telling me we've created a generation of young workers who can't get through the day without an award. So how do we make sure that our people remain learners? That's what my work is about, and that's what I'd like to share with you this evening. In my work, I find that students, I'm going to focus on students, but we've done work with athletes and in businesses. But I want to give you a sense for the framework, and I'll focus on our work with students. So some students hold what I call a fixed mindset. They believe that intelligence is just a fixed trait. You have a certain amount, and that's that. This is the mindset that leads people to become non-learners, because they're so interested in showing how much they have that learning takes a back seat. Other students have a growth mindset. They don't think it's fixed. They think it's something that can be cultivated and developed through learning and quality instruction. They don't think everybody's the same or that anyone can be Einstein, but they understand that even Einstein wasn't Einstein before he put in years and years of dedicated labor. So for people with a growth mindset, the talent you have is a starting point. It's a platform from which you develop. It's not the end-all and be-all. I'm often asked, so which one is correct? And what's so exciting is that more and more research coming out of cognitive psychology and neuroscience is showing the tremendous plasticity of the brain. Its ability to grow, learn, and reorganize with practice. And there's a lot of research now being published where, I'm sure many of you know about it, the underlying cognitive components of intelligence are being identified and taught. I think you'll also be interested to know that Alfred Binet, the inventor of the IQ test, had a radical growth mindset. He believed the most fundamental capacity to learn could be transformed through education, and that's what he devoted most of his life to. He just cooked up the IQ test to figure out which students in the Paris public schools weren't profiting from that curriculum, so he could create a new one and get them back on track. He was beside himself when Americans started using his test to measure intelligence. Does a student hold the same mindset in different life arenas? Not necessarily. Someone can think intelligence is fixed, but athletic ability can be increased or vice versa. Even within intellectual abilities, someone can think math is fixed, but language abilities can be increased or vice versa. And it's the mindset people have in a given area that will be influential. Can mindsets be changed? It's interesting. They're pretty stable left on their own, but now that we understand what they are, we can go in, change them, and see a cascade of consequences. We'll talk about that later. How do mindsets work? They create an entire psychological world where everything has a different meaning. And I'd like to take you through that world. In doing so, I'm going to focus on a study of hundreds of students making transition to 7th grade, which is quite a difficult transition for many of them. And it's a time when many students turn off to school. We often study the mindsets across a challenging transition. That's when they have their biggest effect. I'm going to talk about how mindsets work in terms of 3 mindset rules. So here we go. Rule number 1, in a fixed mindset, because your intelligence is permanent, the cardinal rule is look smart at all times and at all costs. But in a growth mindset, because intelligence is something you can develop, the cardinal rule is learn, learn, learn. In our 7th grade students, we measured their mindsets at the beginning of 7th grade. That is, we saw whether they agreed with statements that portrayed intelligence as fixed or statements that asserted intelligence could be developed. We measured a lot of other things, and we monitored their grades over the next 2 years. Now, for present purposes, we found that those with the fixed mindset said the main thing I want when I do my schoolwork is to show how good I am at it, look smart. But those with a growth mindset said it's much more important for me to learn things in my classes than it is to get the best grades. They cared about grades, but they cared even more about learning. Now, both groups had entered 7th grade with identical achievement test scores. But by the end of the first term, their grades jumped apart and continued to diverge over the next 2 years. The only thing that differed between the 2 groups was their mindset. We found the same thing with pre-med chemistry students at Columbia University, where I used to teach. Nobody cares more about grades than pre-med students. They've lived their lives for this moment. Their parents have lived their lives for this moment. And yet, the students with a growth mindset said they cared even more about learning. And because of this, they ended up getting higher final grades in their organic chemistry course, the gateway to the pre-med curriculum. How did this happen? Because they believed in malleable intelligence and learning, they studied at a deeper level. They managed their motivation, they managed their time, and if they had a disappointing grade on some of the initial tests, they used all the resources at their disposal. They saw the professor, the TA, they formed study groups, and as a group they recovered. But the students with the fixed mindset thought if they had ability, it would somehow show up in their grades. And so when they had a disappointing, they studied at a more surface level, and if they had a disappointing result, they didn't do anything special to try to change that for the next time. More than any study we've ever done, the one I'm about to tell you about shows how a fixed mindset turns students into non-learners. We brought, these were college students, one at a time, into our brainwave lab. We outfitted them with a cap full of electrodes that measured from different parts of their brain, but we were particularly interested in measuring from a region that told us they were harnessing their attention, entering a state of heightened attention, to receive new information. Once they were wired up, we seated them in front of the computer, and the computer asked them a long series of challenging questions. What's the capital of Australia? Canberra. Who was the Union General at the Battle of Gettysburg, Meade, and so forth. They typed in their answer. It was programmed so that they would get only about 40% correct. They typed in their answer. A second and a half later, the computer told them whether they were right or wrong, and a second and a half after that, the computer told them what the right answer really was. So when we looked at the students who had endorsed a fixed mindset, and when we analyzed their EEGs, we saw that they entered a very strong state of attention to find out whether they were right, and that was it. Their job was over. But when we analyzed the brainwaves of students who had endorsed a growth mindset, they entered a strong state of attention here, because right or wrong, whether you're right or wrong is part of learning. But they entered another very strong state of attention here to find out what the correct answer really was. Well, being psychologists, we always have a trick or two up our sleeves. And so at the end of this, we gave everyone a surprise retest on the items they had gotten incorrect. And now we found that the students with a growth mindset scored significantly higher than those with a fixed mindset, meaning they corrected more of their errors. And if you extrapolate that to life, you have one group going around the world saying, "Tell me when I'm right," and the other group saying, "Tell me something I don't know, teach me something new." That brings us to rule number 2. And this is a rule about effort. In a fixed mindset, effort is a bad thing. They believe that if you have ability, well, achievement and success should come naturally. They believe that if you have to try hard at something, it means you're not good at it. In other words, they subscribe to Homer Simpson's maxim, trying is the first step toward failure. And our 7th graders in a fixed mindset say, to tell the truth, when I work hard at my schoolwork, it makes me feel like I'm not very smart. So again, they feel if you have ability, you shouldn't need effort. If you need effort, that casts doubt on your ability. But students with a growth mindset believe that effort is really the key. Effort is what ignites your ability, allows you to use it to the fullest, and ultimately allows it to grow. So they say the harder you work at something, the better you'll be at it. Well, who's right? Do geniuses really work hard, or do things just come naturally to them by virtue of their genius? Some of the most interesting work in psychology now is showing there's basically one thing that separates most geniuses, most people who have made great creative contributions, most people who rise to the top of their field, from others who at one point were equally talented. And that's the deliberate practice that they put in to developing their abilities. And that's not just building on their strengths, but systematically addressing their weaknesses. And let's see. The fixed mindset belief that if you have ability, you shouldn't need effort, I think is one of the worst beliefs students can have. I believe that's why many really, really bright students stop working in school at some point when the material becomes difficult. They've coasted along being told how brilliant they are. They've come to equate low effort success with intelligence, and when work gets difficult, they don't want to do it. They don't want to exert the effort. They don't know how to exert the effort, and many of them simply retire. I also get a lot of letters from people who were child prodigies, child geniuses, saying they didn't know what happened to them. Many of them had never graduated, have not graduated from college or found meaningful work. And again, they were sort of made a false promise. People said, oh, you're so brilliant, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. So they sat there with their brilliance and waited for that to happen, which it didn't. And that grows out of this belief that somehow the ability will accrue success or attract success without work or effort on the part of the individual. Mindset rule number 3. In the face of setbacks, in a fixed mindset, those setbacks reflect on your permanent ability, so you better hide them or conceal them. But in a growth mindset, mistakes, setbacks, deficiencies are remediable, so you want to capitalize them or confront and correct them. In our group of 7th graders, after a poor showing on an exam, in the early part of a course, the students who endorsed a fixed mindset said, I'd spend less time on this subject from now on. We asked, what would you do now? I would try not to take the subject ever again, and I would try to cheat on the next test. So if a setback means you lack ability and effort is not a viable option, these alternative, more circuitous strategy routes become attractive. But in a growth mindset, they say, I would work harder in this class from now on. I'd spend more time studying for the tests. In dozens of studies now, we've shown that a fixed mindset does not give students a good way of recovering from setbacks or failures. Often they become discouraged, give up, retreat to their comfort zone. They blame someone else because they'd rather have someone else be at fault and not take the blame for a deficiency. Or they try to find people who are worse off than they are and feel better. And I can't resist interjecting some studies we did not long ago at Stanford, where we gave students a really, really hard test on which they did poorly. And then we said, well, before the next trial, you can look at some tests of students who took this before you. You can look at the tests of students who did a lot better than you or students who did a lot worse than you. And I can see from some of your smiles, you see where this is going. The students who were in a fixed mindset mostly chose to look at the exams of people who had done a lot worse than they had. We made sure there were no useful strategies on their exam. But after they looked through them, they said, you know, I feel really good about my abilities. I feel like I'm really on top of this material. But again, they had gained no useful information. But the students who were in a growth mindset overwhelmingly chose to look at the exams of people who had done a lot better than they had. And when they felt better about their abilities, it was because they had learned something. Where do mindsets come from? We've investigated this in many ways, but maybe the most interesting is through the praise that adults give to kids, or we give to each other, or employers give to employees, or coaches to athletes. And what I say here is our language tells students what we believe and what we value. As you'll see, kids are really tuned in to messages from the environment about what is valued. We undertook this research at the height of the self-esteem movement, when the gurus were telling everybody to praise children's abilities and talents as lavishly and frequently as possible. We took a poll at the time. 85% of parents agreed you must praise your child's intelligence, to make them feel good about themselves, make them feel motivated. But we thought, wait a minute, we've been studying vulnerable and resilient kids for decades, and it's the vulnerable ones who are overly focused on their ability. And maybe praising intelligence tells kids, oh, I can read your fixed underlying ability from your performance, and maybe it also tells them, that's what I value in you. So the great thing about research is you can ask these questions and then put them to the test. So, here is the needlepoint mantra of the self-esteem movement. Praise your children and they will bloom. I'm going to talk about a group of studies we did with 5th grade students. The results were so striking, we did the study with minor variations. We did it over 5 more times with different groups of kids all over the country. And we kept finding the same thing. So students were brought one at a time into a room in their school. They were given 10 problems from this nonverbal IQ test where you complete the matrix by choosing the one form of the 8. These were not too challenging, most of them did fine, and after they did the 10 problems, they were given one form of praise. A third of the children were given intelligence praise. Wow, that's a really good score. Wow, you got 8 right, say that's a really good score. You must be smart at this. A third were given effort praise, and that's an example of process praise. It doesn't have to be effort, it's the process they engaged in. Strategy, concentration, persistence. In this case, wow, that's a really good score. You must have tried really hard. And a third of the students were in the control group, and they were just told, wow, that's a really good score, kind of good job. The first thing we found was that yes, intelligence praise did put students into more of a fixed mindset compared to the effort praise. But maybe even more interesting is the fact that the intelligence praise instantly made students into non-learners. After the praise, we gave students a choice. We asked, what problems would you like to work on next? Essentially, it was something you're already good at, so you can look smart again, or something that's hard, new, and challenging. You might make mistakes, get confused, but you'll learn something important. The students who had been praised for intelligence, the majority of them, chose the task in their comfort zone. They didn't want to risk their gifted label. But the students who had been praised for effort, the great majority of them, in a couple of the studies, over 90% of them, chose the hard task they can learn from. When you have a growth mindset and are focused on effort, mistakes and confusion are not threatening. They're part of learning. Later on in the session, we gave everyone a really difficult set of problems. And now we saw that the students who had been praised for intelligence lost their confidence. If success meant they were smart, struggle meant they weren't. They showed a sharp decrease in their enjoyment and their desire to take the problems home to practice. But the students praised for effort still had confidence. They saw the problems were harder. They just engaged more fully. And they did not show a decrement in their enjoyment or desire to take them home to practice. In fact, many of them said the hard problems were their favorites. Let's look at what happened to their performance, because we then gave them another set of problems matched in difficulty to the first set. And what we saw was that the students praised for effort showed a sharp increase, a significant increase in their performance on this IQ test from trial 1 to trial 3, because they had remained engaged. And actually some of them taught themselves new strategies on the difficult problems. But the students who were praised for intelligence showed a significant decrease in their performance on these IQ problems as a function of their feeling demotivated and disengaged. But the story doesn't end there. We told the students, we're taking this research, this study, to another school. We bet the kids there would be really interested in your experience. We gave them a piece of paper. We said, don't put your name on it. Just write a few lines about your experience. And then we left a little space for them to report their scores, the scores that they had earned on the problems. What we found was that almost 40% of the students praised for intelligence lied, and only in one direction. Very few of the kids in the other groups saw fit to enhance their result. Well, what does it mean? They were anonymous, they were writing to someone in another school they'd never meet. What it looks to me like is that within a fixed mindset, your performance is equated with your intelligence and maybe even your worth. Maybe you can't even admit to yourself when you struggled and didn't do well. And that's not how we want our students or our kids to be, to think that struggling with something new and hard is so humiliating that you have to cover it up and lie about it. Instead, we want them to be able to freely admit they had difficulty and take steps to remedy that difficulty. So I've just listed a few things here about what to praise. Effort, struggle. Someone said to me recently, in your culture, struggle is a bad word. And I said, you're right. We don't come home at the end of the day and say, honey, I had the most fabulous struggle. We reserve it for really, really bad days. But struggle is just, it just means you committed yourself and worked towards something you value. And I think at the dinner table with our kids or in the classroom, we should say, who had a fantastic struggle today? Persistence in the face of setbacks, strategies, choices in the course of the work, just choosing a challenging task to confront is noteworthy, and all in the context of learning and improvement. I also brought a couple of examples of maybe how you used to praise yesterday and how you might want to praise tomorrow. So yesterday you might say, look, you got an A without really working. You are really good at math. But what does that mean? I only think you're smart when you don't have to work at something? Or you did that so quickly and easily. That's impressive. I'm only impressed when it's quick, easy, without mistakes. Now you can start hearing that language. But maybe tomorrow you'd say, you got an A without working. A's are nice, but you must not be learning much. Or you did that so quickly and easily. I'm sorry I wasted your time. Let's do something you can learn from, or let's do something that's more fun. So easy is boring and a waste of time. Challenging is fun and promotes learning. Once we saw that the growth mindset conferred such benefits, we wondered, could we teach it? And would these benefits accrue? So in our first study along these lines, we took 7th grade students. Many of them were already showing declining grades, and we divided them into 2 groups. The control group got 8 sessions of terrific study skills. They learned them, they loved them, but would they put them into practice? Whereas the experimental group, the growth mindset group, got 8 sessions that contained study skills plus the growth mindset. The growth mindset session kicked off with this article, "You can grow your intelligence. New research shows the brain can be developed like a muscle." They learned that every time they stretched themselves to learn something new, their brains formed new connections, and over time, they got smarter. They were mesmerized by this idea that the growth of their minds was largely in their hands. And we'll never forget one boy who was the bane of our existence. He would not sit still. He was always cutting up with his friends. But when we introduced this article and started discussing it, he sat down, shooed his friends away, and said, "You mean I don't have to be dumb?" And he got to work, as did many of the higher achieving students. And what we saw when we followed them over the course of the semester was that the students who got just the study skills continued to show a decline in their grades. They did not, as a whole, put the study skills into practice. But the students who got study skills plus a growth mindset showed an impressive rebound in their grades. We also asked the teachers, have you noticed changes in students' motivation? And the teachers didn't even know there were 2 groups, yet they singled out 27% of the students in the growth mindset group, 3 times as many as in the control group, to say that they had shown really noticeable changes in their motivation. They wrote long paragraphs or whole pages about each one. For example, they said about the boy I mentioned a while ago that he was now, he had rarely turned in homework, but he was now bringing it in early so that they could go over it together and he could correct his mistakes. And teachers said things like, my students are now, these particular students are now interested in improvement or learning for its own sake. More recently, in order to disseminate this more widely, we created a computer-based intervention that we call Brainology. And you can take a look at it, www.brainology.us. And if you want to preview the whole program, just write to me and we'll send you a password. It teaches, it's an owner's manual for the brain. It teaches kids that they can do lots of things to make their brains work better. And in that context, it teaches them also the growth mindset and how to apply it. Just a few screenshots here. Here are the 2 hip teens. It's aimed at middle school, but students have used it younger and at younger and older ages with good effect. Here are these 2 hip teens that they follow through the program. They're visiting a state-of-the-art brain lab. They meet the mad brain scientist. They do little experiments here. They would click on the nerve endings to show how new connections are made. We piloted this in 20 New York schools, and at the end, we asked students, just using their code names, so they would be anonymous, to tell us whether they had changed their minds about anything. Virtually every one of them said that they had changed their ideas about learning and the way they engage in learning in important ways. But I picked out a few quotes because many of them said that the idea of neurons making new connections was a very motivating image for them. So one said, my favorite thing from Brainology is the neurons part, where when you learn something, there are these connections and they keep growing. I always picture them when I'm in school. Yes, I imagine neurons making connections in my brain, and I feel like I'm learning something. Other kids said, every time I think of not studying, I think, no, my brain won't form new connections. So in conclusion, a growth mindset allows students to embrace learning and growth instead of worrying about how smart they are. It allows them to understand the role of effort in creating talent and intelligence instead of thinking that effort is for people who are somehow lacking in talent or intelligence. It allows them to maintain confidence and effectiveness in the face of challenges and setbacks instead of running for cover, and it can be taught. In a growth mindset environment or educator portrays skills to students as acquirable. It helps them to, it communicates to them that passion, effort, and improvement are valued over just natural talent. And that educator presents him or herself as a mentor and a collaborator, and not someone who is there to judge whether the student has or does not have high intelligence. So I'll stop there, and I'm delighted to take questions. Thank you.
I was wondering, has your research shown anything consistent about the distribution of the fixed versus growth types in the population before they are exposed to your strategies?
Yes. What is the distribution of the mindsets in the population? It's about 40, overall, about 40% of kids agree with the growth mindset, 40 with the fixed, and 20 are non-committal. They kind of jump back and forth on our assessment. But I do worry that with all of this lavish intelligence praise and parents not allowing children to ever make mistakes or get feedback, that it might tilt in the fixed mindset direction.
It's on. Okay. How have the fixed and growth mindsets responded to the world of high-stakes tests?
The world of high-stakes tests, that's another concern, that the high-stakes tests themselves may put students into more of a fixed mindset. It's very important in that context for kids to understand that these tests measure their current skills, not their underlying abilities. And what we did a little study where we said, this is a test that measures important skills. What do you think it measures? And the students with the fixed mindset said they thought it measured important skills, how smart they were, and how smart they'd be when they grow up, equally. Whereas the ones with the growth mindset said, it measures important skills, that's what you told me, but it doesn't measure how smart I am, and it especially doesn't measure how smart I'll be when I grow up. So I think that message has to get across to students that these tests, they're important, they measure your skill level now, but nothing can measure your potential to learn in the future with commitment and quality instruction.
Hi. So,
Hi.
I recently read your book, so I'm very excited to hear your talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, you talked a lot about John McEnroe.
Yes.
And, I mean, so my question to you is, clearly, even though he had a fixed mindset,
Yes.
he still did really
He
well.
did really well.
So I was wondering how you looked at that in terms
Yeah.
of, was it that he could have done that much better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, John McEnroe was incredibly talented. He hated practicing, he hated losing. Many of his losses were because a little thing threw him off, then he started losing it, then he threw a tantrum, which clinched the loss. So yeah, he stayed at the top for 4 years. Maybe he could have stayed at the top for God knows how long, had he worked on his weaknesses And had he even trained his attentional skills? So yeah, he had tremendous talent. He did really well, but he could have done a lot better for a lot longer. For example, one example, he played in a doubles match where he lost, and then he didn't play doubles again for, I don't know, 6, 8 years, something like that. Could have done a lot better at doubles than he ended up doing. Yeah.
Hi. I think, now you're going to have to help me with this, but I think it was Poe Bronson who recently wrote one of those
That's right.
books. So maybe, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I heard him interviewed on the radio and I haven't read the book yet.
Yes.
But it sounds like he was speaking to those parents and supporting them in the fixed
Yeah.
mindset. Is that correct?
No, in the growth mindset.
Was he talking about growth?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Poe Bronson wrote a book called Nurture Shock, and the first chapter is mostly on our praise work. He wrote a cover story for New York Magazine in 2007 on that work, and it sent parents all over the country into a tizzy, because for them the definition of being a good parent was telling your child how smart they were. Many of them formed support groups, and Bronson himself noted in the article that when he stopped praising his child's intelligence and then was with other parents who were doing it, he felt like he was a bad parent. So he reviews the research quite well and then talks about trying to break the habit.
What's the importance of a learning mindset, not to schools only, but also to organizations and businesses?
Yes. We've started work, and other people have done a fair amount of work now about mindsets in organizations and businesses. So first, a series of studies by Peter Heslin at SMU has shown that managers with a fixed mindset are not as attuned to employees' improvement. They categorize employees initially as, being talented or not, and they are not. They do not readily see change compared to managers with a growth mindset. Managers with a fixed mindset, according to their employees, do not take feedback very well. They don't solicit it and they don't welcome it. Let's see. Then and managers with a fixed mindset do not mentor as much. They believe the ones who have it will make it and the ones who don't won't. People are fixed. Whereas those with a growth mindset believe that people need to be mentored and developed. He then created a one-session workshop for experimental purposes, and half of the fixed mindset managers were assigned to either this experimental workshop or control group. And he showed that the workshop that taught a growth mindset led these managers to notice improvement more, take feedback more, and mentor more. So we can see how at the management level that would be really important. Laura Cray and Michael Hazelhoon at Berkeley have looked at what are business, they looked at MBA students' mindsets about negotiation. Are you a born negotiator or is it something that's learned? And they show that those who had a growth mindset did much better in difficult negotiations. And actually, in another study showed that they earned higher grades in their negotiation course, controlling for their overall grades. We have shown recently that people are really good at sniffing out what mindset an organization has and kind of molding themselves to impress that organization. But even though they know they're doing that, it seeps in and affects what they value. So we're looking at this in a number of different ways now.
Thank you very much. Is the changing mindset is possible in any age, or do you see decrease in?
Is
throughout?
changing mindset possible at any age? Yes. Many of these managers were, middle-aged, and it was possible to change their mindsets. So yes, it's possible at any age. We don't know, does it get more difficult? Are there some people who are very invested in their fixed mindset? Probably, but it's still possible at older ages.
So you were over here, sorry.
Here and there. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, the last question sort of pointed at some of the subtle nuances that you might be heading into now. And my question sort of is in that vein. There seemed like a duality here. Either you work really hard or it's easy. And I'm wondering, where does tension when you're learning come in, or stress? Because to some degree you're suggesting that you should have to work hard, and I'm wondering how hard should one have to work before your brain starts to
Fry,
exactly.
So, yeah, it's a neuroscience, technical neuroscience term. How hard should you have to work? Many kids are working too hard. Their parents want them to get into the one right school. A colleague of mine said that as she was growing up, there were 3 pictures on her parents' mantelpiece: a picture of her, a picture of her brother, and a picture of Stanford. So some kids are working night and day, but it's not in a framework of love of learning and love of improvement. It's really just to get that result. And that's not, to me, a growth mindset. So I think what you're getting at, tell me if I'm wrong, is there can be such a thing as too much effort, being on a treadmill, and that's certainly not what I'm advocating.
Hey, Carol. I enjoyed your talk.
Oh, okay.
I'd like to know, when you gave praise to students and you gave them, and you commented that they were smart, how do you define smart? And how did the student define smart?
Yes.
And in a related question.
Well, let me answer that
sure.
first. How did we define smart when we told students, you must be really smart? We did not define it. How do they define smart? In several studies actually with different ages of students, we asked them to tell us what they thought intelligence was. And there was some relationship between the mindset they endorsed and the definition they gave. So those with the fixed mindset were more likely to talk about some large underlying capacity, whereas more of the students with a growth mindset were talking about a body of skills and knowledge. But there was a lot of overlap as well.
And when you want to and when you use the word intelligence, did you look at intelligence from a multiple intelligence point of view, where there are about 7 categories of intelligence?
No, in this case, we just used the word intelligence. In some studies, if we're looking at math, we use math intelligence. But we didn't look at it from the standpoint of multiple intelligences. But I will say one thing. Joshua Aronson, a very fine researcher, did a growth mindset intervention at Stanford with Stanford students. One of his control groups was a multiple intelligence intervention where he told students, don't worry if you're not doing well in one area, you may be really great in another area. And that did not motivate them or lead to an increase in grades as the growth mindset intervention did.
Last question. Here we go.
Did you see any difference from children before 7th grade in either growth or fixed mindset than from after 7th grade? Any percentage difference?
That's an interesting question. Did we see a difference in the mindsets of students before 7th grade and after 7th grade? We haven't followed the same kids over that period. It may be that more of them are adopting a fixed mindset when they feel tested by 7th grade. I think that would be very interesting to look at.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.